Welcome back. Now, according to Stats SA, electricity consumption increased by 2.7% year-on-year in November 2024. The country last experienced load shedding in March last year, but financial advisory firm Cresco has warned that rolling blackouts could return this month. Cresco Group's Executive Director Robert Futter joins us with more detail around this prediction. Thank you so much for your time, Robert. Now, the issue of load shedding rests on the energy availability factor, right? So where are we now, and what would have to happen to plunge us back into darkness?
So just to clarify, rolling blackouts is a strong term for, I think, what we spoke about last year. I'm conscious everything always comes out.
Yeah.
I think what we did last year was do some long-term analysis, and what we did see that there is going to be a supply-demand imbalance, which will probably end up in sort of levels of 1 or 2 levels of load shedding using the old terminology. And what we've seen to date is Eskom has been managing that really well, either with additional diesel generation or using their large users to curtail their demand. So many large users are on special contract with Eskom, and for Eskom that is probably the easiest way to balance the grid. So we know that's happening. I think one of the reasons that we are concerned about specifically end of January, February is we typically see an increase in demand in those periods. SA's demand is different during the day. It's also different based on seasonality, and we typically see an increase. We also see it in winter, obviously, when we all switch on our heaters. And then typically Eskom has also reduced or put more of their fleets on planned maintenance during those times because they expect the higher demand. So with those two, higher demand, slightly less generation, we do expect there will be constrained demand, supply versus demand. And at the moment, we hope that Eskom can manage to utilize the large energy users and their other generation like diesel to balance the grid. So far, they've been doing a great job. So we're not here to throw anything at Eskom. We think they're amazing, but I think we are maybe not at knife edge, but it's a bit more sensitive than it was perhaps end of last year. And we also just hope that these old power stations that have been brought back up and seem to be operating at fairly good EAFs will continue to be there. But as we know, if you keep on running your old Defender, even though it's a Defender and it promises 1 million kilometers, it will break at some stage. So we might see some uptick in unplanned maintenance that might give small events, but I don't think we see rolling blackouts in the foreseeable future, but we do see issues, and that will obviously affect GDP in an indirect way, because if the mines aren't producing there, so there will be secondary impacts rather than a direct lack of energy supply.
All right. I do note that, of course, when it does come back, it will be at lower levels, maybe 1, maybe 2. For me, also what was quite interesting is that in your projections for between 2025 and 2027, of course, you mentioned that they should come in specific months. You mentioned January, February, and also the winter months. But also what really stuck out for me is that between 2028 and 2030, you do expect load shedding to intensify, and I'm wondering why that is, considering the fact that there would be more renewable energy coming online.
Yeah, so I mean, a electron from PV and an electron from coal are not the same thing, right? At 12 o'clock in the day, they are the same thing, but 6 o'clock in the evening, coal is producing, PV is not. So we do expect there to be more generation in the grid, but unfortunately, renewables is not the right time of the day that we always needed. So that's what we see, is that there is this energy transition, to use the word, between more renewables, but unfortunately, renewables not always being there when we need it. And that's why we need the storage to come in. And we still see a large amount of storage, but perhaps not to the scale. So there's a good story because we're decarbonizing the grid, but a bit of a technical risk because of the type of energy that's there. And we've seen that from Australia too, where they're having grid outages because they have too much renewables or they don't have enough demand and they have a different view. But that whole outlook is very much premised on when Eskom decommissions their coal fleet. And I'm conscious that Eskom are under pressure. On the one hand, you want to decarbonize, they have a whole lot of obligations, but you're not going to switch off a coal fleet and then no one has energy and then you're running diesel engines. So they're balancing this quite carefully from that point of view. But if you just take a decommission plan based on some of the stations going offline and you add more renewables, it's not that we won't have enough supply versus demand. We won't have enough supply versus demand at certain times of the day because of the mismatch.
So at this point, would you say that the speed of renewable energy coming online, the speed of the growth in the pipeline, there is going as it should, but the main problem here is really storage, really?
Yeah, so we need to be able to take that cheap energy at 12 o'clock in the day relative to coal and put it into storage devices and then dispatch it in the early evenings. And, from our article, we did this 24/7 graph where you see renewable penetration, and it's super green in the middle of the day, but it's still very gray because it's coal in the early evenings and that's what we need to make a step change globally. It's not just South Africa. We all need a step change. We need different type of battery technologies. We can't use lithium forever. We need other technology, and we're still working towards that scale. And we expect that to filter down to SA eventually.
So at this point, is it a case of should we panic or not panic, Robert?
No, so at this stage, in the short term, it's just be aware. I think we want to know that the grid is constrained. It's still, Eskom's doing a good point. And I think going into the future, we must also be aware that the grid is going to have different challenges. And the type of load shedding or lack constrained supply is maybe a better word than load shedding, because it's a bit of a politicized comment, right? Will be due to different reasons. And it's not necessarily because Eskom's not performing, it's because we have this other generation profile. But it creates a huge opportunity for us also to change our demand practices, right? And that's because that is the cheapest way to generate energy, is to change the demand. So let's rather switch our kettles on at 12 o'clock in the day rather than 6 o'clock at night. Run your washing machine. So, changing your demand profile will also help this future imbalance. So it's not just additional supply, it's also changing demand.
Well, on that demand, have these interventions worked? Because, of course, whenever we do have load shedding, we do have, messages from Eskom also for us to kind of lower our demand. Has it worked in the past before?
Yeah, so firstly, these measures have worked because one of the big reasons we didn't have load shedding last year is because we had all this PV put on people's residential roofs, right? So the middle of the day, we were sort of covered. So I'd say that message has worked.
Okay.
I guess the problem is that, and that's why they load shed for residential clients and they load curtail for large mines, because you and I are not so good at listening to what people tell us, right?
Yeah.
And if I'm watching my favorite rugby or PSL game and they say switch it off, it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a mining entity, they understand that there's greater things. So I think, unfortunately, sometimes you've just got to use a big stick for certain type of users, because otherwise we won't continue that demand behavior. But as Eskom changes their tariff structure, and that's very relevant at the moment, I'm sure you're aware Eskom's got this tariff plan, and that will change the structure. And we see this tariff plan go down to residential, because at the moment most residential people just pay a single tariff. But we go to time of use, you'll see the stick, and that switching your oven on at 6 o'clock in the evening is going to cost you a lot of money, whereas perhaps preheating the oven earlier in the day will cost you less. And so I think that stick, from a financial point of view, will drive behavior more than the message saying switch off now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and giving us those insights there, Robert. Much appreciated. That was Cresco Group's Executive Director, Robert Futter.